In a quiet town far from the noise of the cities, nestled between rolling hills and quiet streets, there stood an old hotel called the Willow Inn. It wasn't the kind of place anyone sought out on purpose, but it welcomed everyone, just the same: travelers needing rest, families passing through, or people simply searching for warmth. The inn's owner, Henry Wilkes, loved the Willow Inn in the way one loves an old companion. He'd inherited it from his father nearly 20 years earlier, and though it wasn't much, it was enough. The building creaked in places, the wooden beams carried the weight of time, and the rugs were frayed at the edges. But it was a place of shelter, and Henry worked hard to keep it that way. Henry himself was a man of quiet ways. In his early 40s, his brown eyes carried the kind of calm you only saw in those who had spent years living humbly. He was practical, patching up furniture instead of buying new and wearing the same sweater every winter, its elbows worn but carefully mended. Henry wasn't wealthy, but he didn't mind. He lived with the belief that small efforts mattered, that if you fixed what was broken, showed kindness where it was needed, and kept a door open, life would be as it was meant to be. On a cold, rainy evening, Henry was preparing to lock up the front lobby when he noticed something: a shadowed figure sitting beneath the overhang of the porch. It was the kind of steady rain that soaked through to the bone, and Henry paused, hand still on the door, his brow furrowing in concern. The man on the steps sat hunched over, shoulders tight against the cold, his coat dripping rainwater into dark pools on the wooden porch. Henry sighed quietly and stepped out, his boots making a gentle creak on the planks. "Evening," he said softly, so as not to startle the man. The man looked up, his face partially hidden under the brim of an old baseball cap. His expression was pale and tired, as if life had been carrying him too far for too long. He blinked at Henry, his lips parting as though he wanted to speak, but no words came out. "I didn't mean to be a bother," the man mumbled finally, his voice scratchy and low. "I'll move along. I just needed to stay dry for a bit." Henry studied him quietly for a moment. The man looked younger than Henry had first thought, but the weight of his troubles seemed to add years to his face. His shoes were worn, the soles peeling, and his coat looked threadbare in places, no match for the cold that clung to everything this time of year. Henry could see it plainly: this man was holding on to what little dignity he had left. And dignity, Henry knew, was hard to keep when you had nowhere to go. "It's pouring out here," Henry replied gently. "Come inside, you'll catch your death in this cold." The man hesitated, shaking his head slightly. "I don't have any money for a room, sir. I didn't ask for any," Henry said, his voice calm but firm. "Come on now. There's no sense in you sitting out here." The man looked up at Henry with eyes that seemed to search him, as though unsure whether to trust what he was hearing. Finally, the rain seemed to make the decision for him. He stood stiffly, his movements slow and cold, and followed Henry into the warm glow of the lobby. Inside, the Willow Inn smelled faintly of coffee and pine wood, a result of Henry's habit of lighting a fire in the lobby's old stove and brewing fresh coffee every evening. The man hovered near the doorway, dripping water onto the rug as he shifted uncomfortably in place. Henry grabbed a key from the peg behind the desk and turned back to him. "What's your name?" "Adam," the man replied after a long pause. "Well, Adam, I'm Henry. Room 3 is yours for the night. It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry." Adam stared at the key Henry held out to him, as if it were something he wasn't sure he deserved. His hands trembled slightly as he took it. "You're serious?" Henry smiled faintly, his eyes kind. "I wouldn't say it if I didn't mean it." Adam swallowed, looking down at the key in his palm. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "I'll be out by morning, I promise." "There's no rush," Henry said softly. "Get some sleep. It's been a long day, I reckon." Adam gave a small, grateful nod before trudging upstairs, his wet shoes squeaking softly against the wooden steps. Henry watched him go, his heart quiet but steady. He knew what it was to want to keep your pride when life had beaten you down. He didn't need to know Adam's story to understand that whatever road had brought him here, it hadn't been an easy one. The rain streaked down the glass in silvery trails, tapping gently against the panes. "It's just one night," Henry murmured to himself, as though to justify the choice he'd made. But deep down, he didn't need to justify it. Offering shelter to someone in need felt as natural as breathing. The next morning, Henry woke before dawn, as he always did. He brewed coffee in the small kitchen behind the front desk, the rich smell filling the inn as the sun began to rise. Part of him wondered if Adam would already be gone, that he would leave quietly to avoid any further kindness. But when Henry checked the dining area, he found Adam sitting alone at the corner table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Henry's old blue mug sat in front of him, and for a moment, Adam looked less like a man who had lost his way and more like someone who was simply resting. Henry approached with the coffee pot. "Morning," he said. Adam looked up, startled. "Good morning," he replied, clearing his throat. I hope you don't mind. I found the coffee." "No harm in that," Henry said, pouring a fresh cup. "Need a refill?" Adam hesitated before nodding. "Please." Henry sat down across from him, noticing how the young man's hand still shook slightly, as though his body hadn't quite remembered what warmth felt like yet. "Where are you headed today?" Adam shrugged, staring into the coffee. "Don't know. Wherever I can find work, I guess." Henry watched him for a moment before speaking. "There's a garage down the road, about a mile from here. Mr. Garrett runs it. He's always looking for someone to lend a hand moving things around or fixing odds and ends. He doesn't pay much, but he's fair." Adam looked up sharply, his eyes searching Henry's face again. You'd vouch for me?" Henry shrugged, offering a small smile. "All I know is you've been polite and grateful, and that's a good start for anyone." Adam opened his mouth as though to protest, but instead he closed it and nodded slowly. "Thank you, Henry. I'll try." Henry stood, patting the young man gently on the shoulder as he passed. "That's all anyone can do." By the time the sun had fully risen, Adam was gone, leaving the room as neat as he'd found it. On the nightstand, Henry found a small note written on a scrap of paper. "I don't know how to thank you, but I won't forget this. Adam." Henry tucked the note into his pocket, a quiet smile playing at his lips. He didn't expect to see Adam again. He'd given him a place to rest, and that was enough. It wasn't a grand act, just one small kindness, offered freely and without expectation. But Henry knew that sometimes, one night under a warm roof could make all the difference in the world. The days at the Willow Inn settled into their familiar rhythm, quiet and steady as winter crept closer. Henry went about his usual work, sweeping the porch, checking light fixtures, and stoking the small stove in the lobby to keep the cold at bay. The rain from that night had long since passed, replaced by crisp mornings and frosted window panes. Still, Henry found his thoughts drifting occasionally to Adam, the quiet, tired man who had slept in room 3. It wasn't that Henry expected thanks or explanations that wasn't his way, but something about the young man had stuck with him. Perhaps it was the look in Adam's eyes when Henry handed him the key, a look of disbelief, as though he couldn't quite understand why a stranger would offer him anything without asking for something in return. One afternoon, a few days after Adam had gone, Henry heard the small bell above the inn's door jingle. He looked up from polishing the front desk to see Mr. Garrett, the owner of the garage down the road, stepping inside. Garrett was a big man with a booming voice, his hands always marked with grease and hard work. "Afternoon," Henry Garrett called, stomping snow off his boots and rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Afternoon," Garrett, Henry replied, setting his cloth aside. "Come in out of the cold. Coffee's hot if you'd like some." Garrett grinned. "Don't mind if I do." He made his way to the small coffee station in the corner of the lobby and poured himself a cup. As he stirred in a spoonful of sugar, he turned back to Henry with an approving nod. "That fella you sent my way, Adam, was it? He's a good kid." Henry paused mid-motion, his brow lifting in surprise. Adam's working for you. Garrett nodded, settling into the old armchair near the fire. Showed up at the garage 2 mornings ago. Said you'd mentioned I might need a hand. I was hesitant at first, you know how it is. You get all sorts drifting through town, and not everyone's willing to work for what they need. He took a sip of his coffee. Then smiled. But this one's different. He's got something about him, a quiet determination, I guess you'd call it. He doesn't say much, but he works hard. I've had him moving tools, cleaning up the place, and even helping me on a few old cars. Turns out he knows his way around an engine. Henry couldn't help but smile at that. I didn't know he had that kind of experience. Garrett chuckled. Neither did I. He's got a knack for fixing things, says his dad taught him when he was young. I'm glad you sent him my way, Henry. I don't know where he came from or what his story is, but a man willing to work hard and keep his word is a rare find these days. Henry's chest warmed at Garrett's words. He hadn't thought much about what might come of his suggestion that Adam try the garage. He'd simply seen someone in need of a chance and pointed him toward it. But hearing that Adam had taken the opportunity and made something of it filled Henry with quiet pride, not in himself, but in Adam. Glad to hear it, Henry said with a nod. Garrett stood, setting his empty coffee cup on the counter. If you see him again, tell him I'll have work for him as long as he needs it. A man like that deserves a break. I'll let him know, Henry replied, though he wasn't sure if he'd see Adam again. People like Adam often pass through, their lives leading them down unseen roads. After Garrett left, Henry sat down in the armchair by the fire, letting its warmth settle over him. He thought about Adam, how he'd arrived in the rain, soaked and exhausted, but still holding on to his dignity. Henry had only offered him a room, but now Adam was finding his footing, piece by piece. It reminded Henry of something his father used to say when he ran the inn all those years ago. You can't save the whole world, son, but you can keep one door open. That's enough. Henry smiled faintly to himself. It didn't take much to change someone's life, just a moment of kindness, a little bit of faith, and the belief that no one was ever too far gone to start again. A week later, Henry was clearing snow off the front steps of the inn when he saw someone walking up the road toward him. The figure was bundled up against the cold, a cap pulled low over his face and a small bag slung over his shoulder. As he got closer, Henry recognized him immediately. Morning, Henry, Adam said, his voice steady but quieter than Henry remembered. Morning, Adam, Henry replied, leaning his shovel against the railing. What brings you this way? Adam stopped at the bottom of the steps, shifting his bag onto his other shoulder. I just wanted to say thank you for what you did that night. Henry waved a hand, brushing it off. No need for that. It was just a room. Adam shook his head. It wasn't just a room, Henry. You didn't know me. I could have been anyone, and you let me in anyway. I needed that more than you know. Henry looked at Adam carefully. There was something different about him now. His shoulders were straighter, his voice steadier, and the lines on his face didn't seem quite so deep. He looked like a man who'd found his footing, even if it was only just the beginning. Mr. Garrett says you've been helping him out, Henry said, smiling faintly. Adam nodded, a small hint of pride in his expression. He's been good to me. Gave me a place to work, and I've been saving what I can. I don't know what's next, but it's a start. Henry leaned against the railing, studying Adam with quiet approval. That's all any of us can ask for, Adam. One step at a time. Adam looked down at the snow-covered ground for a moment before meeting Henry's gaze again. I wanted to bring you something, he said, reaching into his bag. He pulled out a small paper bag and handed it to Henry. What's this? Henry asked, taking it. Pastries from Mrs. Larkin's bakery, Adam replied, his voice almost shy. I got paid yesterday. It's not much, but I wanted to say thank you. Henry opened the bag and pulled out 2 golden brown pastries, dusted with sugar. They were still warm, their sweet smell filling the crisp winter air. He looked up at Adam, his smile soft but full. "You didn't have to do this," Henry said quietly. "I know," Adam replied. "But I wanted to." Henry gestured toward the door. "Come on inside. No sense in standing out here in the cold." The two men went inside, where the fire was already crackling softly in the lobby. Henry set the pastries on the table and poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Adam before sitting across from him. For a while they ate in silence, the quiet warmth of the inn settling around them like a blanket. "You know," Henry said after a while, "you've done the hard part yourself, Adam. I just opened the door." Adam looked up, meeting Henry's gaze. "Sometimes that's all a person needs," he said softly. "Someone to open a door." Henry nodded, his chest warm with something he couldn't quite name. He thought of his father's words again, the ones he'd carried with him all these years: "You can't save the whole world, son, but you can keep one door open." And as Henry sat there with Adam, sharing coffee and warm pastries by the fire, he felt it in his bones how right his father had been. The days grew colder as November settled in, bringing a soft quiet to the town. The Willow Inn became even more of a refuge during this time, its windows glowing warmly against the gray skies. Henry went about his usual routine, sweeping the front steps of fallen leaves that had turned to frost, tightening window frames against drafts, and ensuring the fire in the lobby stove never died out. Life at the inn was steady, though not always easy. Fewer guests meant tighter finances, but Henry took it in stride. He'd lived long enough to know that seasons of scarcity came and went. For now, he focused on keeping the Willow Inn welcoming for anyone who happened by. It was one of those crisp, cloudless mornings when Henry saw a familiar figure walking up the road. Adam's head was down, his hands stuffed into his worn coat pockets as he made his way toward the inn. He looked different than the last time Henry had seen him, still thin, but his posture was straighter, his step more purposeful. Henry opened the front door as Adam approached. "Morning, Adam," he called out, his breath turning to mist in the cold air. Adam looked up, a small smile crossing his face. "Morning, Henry." "Come in," Henry said, stepping aside. "It's too cold to stand out there." Adam hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. The warmth of the lobby wrapped around him, and Henry could see the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. Adam looked better. His coat was still threadbare, but clean, and his face had more color than it had that rainy night weeks ago. "Coffee's on," Henry said, motioning to the small side table where a pot of coffee steamed gently. "Help yourself." "Thanks," Adam said quietly. He poured himself a cup, his hands wrapping around the mug for warmth. Henry could see the faint traces of grease under his fingernails and the calluses forming on his palms, a sign of work. Henry leaned against the desk, studying him with quiet interest. "Garrett tells me you've been helping him out at the garage." Adam looked up sharply, as if surprised that anyone had noticed. "Yeah, he's been good to me. Gave me a chance when I needed one." "You've been good to yourself," Henry replied simply. "He says you know your way around an engine." Adam ducked his head, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "My dad taught me when I was a kid. I used to help him fix up cars in his garage after school. It's been a while since I've worked on anything, but I guess it came back to me." Henry nodded. "Garrett's a good man, and he doesn't waste words. If he says you're doing a good job, he means it." Adam didn't say anything for a moment. He stared into his coffee, as though trying to find the right words. Finally, he looked up. "I wanted to come by and thank you, Henry, for what you did that night. Letting me stay here, no questions asked. It meant more than I can explain." Henry shrugged gently, as though it wasn't worth making a fuss over. It was just a room. "No, it wasn't," Adam replied firmly, his voice low but steady. "You didn't know me, but you helped me anyway. I don't think I'd have made it through that night if you hadn't opened the door." Henry felt a quiet warmth settle in his chest, though he said nothing. He wasn't a man who sought praise or thanks. To him, helping Adam had been as natural as breathing something done because it was right, not because it earned recognition. Adam shifted slightly, pulling a small cloth-wrapped bundle from his pocket and holding it out. "I brought this for you." Henry frowned slightly. "What's this?" "Pastries," Adam said, a bit awkwardly. "From Mrs. Larkin's bakery. I got paid yesterday, and I thought you might like them." Henry took the bundle carefully, unwrapping it to reveal 2 golden brown pastries dusted with sugar. The smell was warm and sweet, a contrast to the cold day outside. Henry looked back at Adam, his voice soft. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," Adam replied. "You gave me a chance. I wanted to do something, even if it's small." Henry nodded, smiling faintly as he set the pastries on the table. "Well, you're just in time then. I haven't had breakfast yet. Sit down, and we'll share these." For a moment, Adam looked as though he wanted to decline. But after a small pause, he nodded and sat in one of the chairs by the fire. Henry poured them both fresh coffee and broke one of the pastries in half, handing a piece to Adam. They sat there together, the crackling fire filling the silence. It was a quiet moment, but not an empty one. Henry asked about Adam's work at the garage, and Adam spoke about how Garrett had been teaching him new things, letting him fix small parts on his own, trusting him to handle more. "It feels good," Adam admitted after a moment, staring into the flames. "Working again, I mean. It's been a long time since I've had a reason to get up in the morning. Garrett's rough around the edges, but he's been patient with me." Henry nodded, understanding more than he let on. He'd seen what aimlessness could do to a man, how it could wear away at his spirit, until even the simplest tasks felt impossible. A purpose, no matter how small, could change everything. "You're doing good," Adam, Henry said softly. "You should be proud of that." Adam looked over at him, and for a moment, Henry saw something in his expression, a flicker of hope, like a spark catching hold. "Thanks, Henry," Adam said quietly. "I'm trying." "That's all any of us can do," Henry replied. When Adam left a little while later, Henry stood at the window and watched him walk back down the road toward Garrett's garage, his step steady and sure. He thought again of the rainy night when Adam had appeared on his porch, drenched and defeated, carrying little more than the weight of his troubles. Now, though, Adam was different. He wasn't whole yet, Henry could see that, but he was walking forward. And sometimes Henry thought, that was enough. As he turned back to the quiet inn, the warmth of the fire filling the empty space, Henry felt something settle in his chest, a simple, quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about being thanked or being remembered. It was about the knowledge that kindness, offered freely, had made a difference. He didn't know where Adam's path would lead, but as far as Henry was concerned, that wasn't his to worry about. He had done his part, and that was enough. The months rolled quietly by, as they always did at the Willow Inn. Winter gave way to spring, and the snow that once blanketed the town melted into clear puddles and rushing streams. Henry spent the days tending to the inn, painting the porch railings, and planting marigolds in the small garden beds that lined the walkway. The inn was never bustling, but it was steady, like Henry himself. Travelers still stopped by, salesmen on long trips, families needing rest, or the occasional lost soul passing through town. Henry welcomed them all with the same quiet warmth, asking for nothing in return except that they find a bit of peace before moving on. He thought about Adam from time to time, wondering how the young man was doing at the garage, whether he had found his footing or drifted to another town. Garrett stopped by occasionally for coffee and always spoke well of Adam. "You wouldn't believe it," Henry Garrett had said just a few weeks ago, leaning back in the old chair by the fire. "I gave him that junker Ford to fix up on his own, told him if he could get it running, I'd let him take on more repairs. I didn't think he'd do it, to be honest. Next thing I know, the kid's out there, engine roaring like it's brand new. I gave him a raise. Told him I could use him long term if he'd stay." Henry had smiled quietly to himself, a deep satisfaction settling in his chest. He hadn't asked Garrett for updates, but knowing Adam was still in town, working hard, made Henry proud. He had done nothing more than open a door that night, given a man a place to rest, but Adam had walked through it and chosen to keep going. It was a bright summer morning when Henry heard the bell above the inn's front door ring. He had just finished sweeping the porch and was dusting his hands off when he looked up to see Adam standing in the doorway. At first, Henry almost didn't recognize him. The man standing there was a far cry from the rain-soaked figure who had appeared on his porch all those months ago. Adam's coat was new, a sturdy work jacket, and his boots, though worn, were solid and practical. He looked healthier, stronger. His shoulders were back, his face had color, and his eyes, for the first time, held a quiet confidence. "Morning, Henry," Adam said, smiling as he stepped inside. Henry smiled back, a deep warmth spreading in his chest. "Adam. Morning. You're looking well?" Adam nodded, still smiling. "I am, thanks to you." "You found your footing?" Then Henry asked as he leaned on the counter. Adam chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah. I guess you could say that. I'm still at the garage, but Garrett promoted me a couple of months back. He said I'd earned it." "Good man." "That Garrett," Henry said with a knowing nod. Adam smiled wider. "Yeah, I've been fixing up cars full-time now, taking on my own repairs and even helping him with customers. I've saved up enough to rent a small place over on Maple Street. It's nothing fancy, but it's mine. I've got a roof over my head, food in the fridge, and steady work. Life's been." Henry felt a lump rise in his throat, though he swallowed it down. There was no better sight than seeing someone find their way again, someone who had been weighed down by so much now walking with purpose. "I'm glad to hear that, Adam. You've earned it." Adam's expression grew serious as he reached into the pocket of his jacket. "There's something else, Henry." Henry frowned slightly as Adam pulled out a plain white envelope and held it out to him. "What's this?" Adam held the envelope out firmly, his voice steady but full of emotion. "It's for you. Open it." Henry hesitated, his brow furrowing. But he took the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside was a stack of bills, crisp 20s and 10s, neatly counted and bundled. Henry looked up sharply. "Adam, what is this?" "It's $2,500, Adam said softly. "I've been saving up since I started at the garage. I know you'll say you don't want it, but I need you to understand something, Henry. That night you let me stay here, it changed my life." Henry opened his mouth to protest, but Adam held up a hand, his voice steady and sure. "You didn't just give me a room, Henry, you gave me dignity. You looked at me like I was still worth something, even when I didn't believe it myself. That night was the first time in months I felt like a human being again. And because of you, I found the strength to keep going." Henry looked down at the envelope again, then back at Adam, his chest tight. "Adam, I didn't do anything but open a door. You did the rest yourself." Adam smiled faintly. "Maybe. But you opened the door when no one else would. And sometimes that's all a person needs." Henry's hands trembled slightly as he held the envelope. "I can't take this, Adam. You've worked hard for it. You should keep it for yourself." Adam shook his head. "It's yours, Henry. I want you to use it for the inn. Fix what needs fixing. Buy yourself something you've been putting off. Just let it remind you that kindness matters. That you made a difference." Henry stared at him for a long moment, the lump in his throat impossible to ignore now. He finally set the envelope down on the desk and extended his hand. Adam shook it firmly, the handshake one of mutual respect and understanding. "You've come a long way," Adam, Henry said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Adam nodded, his eyes steady. "And I wouldn't have made it this far without you." Henry let go of his hand and smiled faintly. "Well, if you're ever in need of another room or a cup of coffee, you know where to find me." Adam chuckled softly. "I'll take you up on that sometime. But not because I need to, just because I want to." As Adam left the inn, Henry stood by the window and watched him go. The man who walked down the road toward town was no longer the lost soul who had once huddled on Henry's porch, soaked and defeated. He was someone new, a man with purpose, with hope, and with a future that now seemed brighter than it ever had before. Henry looked at the envelope on the counter, his heart full. He didn't need the money, not really. It wasn't about the bills themselves. It was about the truth Adam had spoken, that kindness mattered. That the smallest acts, the simplest gestures, could ripple out in ways no one could predict. Henry tucked the envelope into his pocket, already thinking about how he'd use it to fix the peeling paint on the shutters, the drafty windows upstairs, the creaky floorboards that needed attention. He would take care of it, because that's what he did. And as he turned back to the quiet inn, the fire crackling gently in the stove, Henry felt something deep and sure settle in his chest. His father had been right all those years ago. You can't save the whole world, son, but you can keep one door open. That's enough. And it was enough. It always had been. The weeks following Adam's visit were brighter for Henry. Though not much about the Willow Inn changed on the outside. It was still the same modest building with its creaky floors, patched rugs, and warm lantern lights spilling onto the porch in the evenings. But to Henry, the inn felt different, more alive somehow, as though Adam's return had reminded him of something simple yet important. The money Adam had given him sat in a small envelope tucked safely in Henry's desk drawer. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than enough to fix what needed fixing. Henry hadn't touched it right away, though. He wanted to be deliberate about how he used it, mindful that this money, however small, represented something bigger. Over the next few weeks, Henry hired a local carpenter to mend the porch railings, which had begun to splinter with age. He replaced the worn curtains in the lobby with new ones, letting in more light than before, and had the windows upstairs properly sealed so they no longer rattled in the wind. He even used a small part of the money to buy fresh linens for the guest rooms, something he hadn't done in years. The changes were simple, but they felt like a breath of fresh air. Henry didn't tell anyone where the money had come from, and no one asked. To the handful of guests who stopped by, the inn looked the same as it always had, small, warm, and inviting. But to Henry, every repaired window, every fresh coat of paint, was a quiet tribute to the power of kindness. One sunny afternoon in late summer, Henry sat on the front porch, taking a rare moment to rest. He sipped iced tea from an old glass and looked out at the sleepy little street that stretched through town. The marigolds he'd planted earlier in the season swayed gently in the breeze, their bright yellow blooms a cheerful contrast to the worn wooden steps. He was just about to stand and head back inside when he heard a familiar voice call out, "Morning, Henry." Henry looked up to see Adam walking toward him, smiling as he carried a large box in his arms. His work jacket was slung over his shoulder, and his face was relaxed, almost glowing with confidence and contentment. "Adam," Henry said, surprised but pleased. "You're back." Adam grinned as he set the box carefully on the porch railing. "I told you I'd stop by, didn't I?" "You did," Henry said with a chuckle. "But I wasn't expecting a delivery." He nodded toward the box. "What have you got there?" Adam patted the top of it proudly. "A little something for the Willow Inn." Henry raised an eyebrow, already knowing Adam well enough to guess what was coming. "You've done more than enough already." Adam shook his head firmly, his expression sincere. "This isn't about owing you, Henry. It's about giving back to the place that gave me a second chance." Henry looked at Adam for a moment, then nodded quietly. "All right then. Let's see what you've got." Adam opened the box, revealing a brand new wooden sign. It was sturdy and simple, the letters carefully carved and painted by hand. "The Willow Inn, a place to rest, a place to start." Henry stared at the sign for a long moment, the words settling deep in his chest. He ran a hand over the smooth surface, feeling the care that had gone into every letter. "You made this?" he asked softly. Adam nodded. "Garrett let me use his tools on my day off." I wanted you to have something to mark what this place really is, a place where people can catch their breath and start over. Like I did. Henry blinked hard, swallowing past the lump that rose in his throat. It's beautiful, Adam. Thank you. Adam smiled faintly. You gave me a door to walk through, Henry. Now I want other people to see what the Willow Inn can mean for them, too. Henry looked at the sign again, a deep warmth spreading in his chest. Well, he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, let's get it hung up. Then. The two men worked side by side, carefully replacing the old, faded sign that had hung above the inn's porch for decades. When they were done, Henry stepped back and looked up at the new sign, the sunlight catching the clean, bold letters. A place to rest. A place to start, Henry murmured, the words settling into him like they belonged. Adam clapped a hand on Henry's shoulder, his voice light but sincere. I'm glad you like it. Henry turned to him, smiling softly. I do, and I'm proud of you, Adam. You've come a long way. Adam shrugged, though his eyes shone with gratitude. I had good people to guide me. People like you. Henry didn't reply right away. He just looked at Adam, at the man he had become, and felt something deep and quiet settle within him. It wasn't pride exactly, though there was some of that. It was more a sense of gratitude that life had brought Adam to his door that rainy night, and that he had been able to help him, even in the smallest way. The two of them sat together on the porch for a while, drinking tea and watching the world pass by. It wasn't much, Henry thought, but it was enough. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the street with golden light, Henry looked up at the new sign once more and smiled. The inn had always been a place of rest, but now it felt like something more. It was a place of hope, a place where lost souls could find their footing, even if only for a night. Henry's father had always said, "You can't save the whole world, son, but you can keep one door open. That's enough." And now Henry knew, deep in his heart, how right his father had been. Every evening after that, as Henry turned on the porch lanterns and prepared for the quiet of night, he would pause for just a moment to look at the sign. It reminded him that kindness, no matter how small, could change everything. And though the world outside was wide and uncertain, the Willow Inn and Henry's door would always be open.